Thanks to Blackmagic Design for sponsoring this video. How do you communicate the passage of time in a movie? You could do it in a single cut. You could do it in a montage. But perhaps the most effective is to make the audience experience the slow passage of time firsthand as the characters do, in a long take. Hi everybody, Tyler here. So back in 2019, I was working on a project called 8hours.com, where we made a database of video essays on movies and television. And part of the project was an idea I had to make video essays that would be by filmmakers and university professors. So this involved me interviewing them over Zoom, and they would record themselves with their phones and then send me the audio, and I would cut it up into a video essay structure. One of the coolest interviews I did was with writer-director David Lowery, who was actually working on The Green Knight when I interviewed him. I loved the movie he made called A Ghost Story, following a man who dies and experiences time as a ghost. I've never seen anything quite like it. Lowry makes us experience time in a unique way, traveling backward and forward through great stretches of time, alongside experiencing the weight of real time, like a scene in which Rooney Mara eats an entire pie in one unbroken take. I asked Lowry about his use of long takes to express the feeling of endless time, extending forwards and backwards, and this is what he said.
Hi, my name is David Lowery. I wrote and directed A Ghost Story. I think the first time I was exposed to a film that utilized time in a unique and novel way was Gus Van Sant's Jerry. That was the first time I'd seen a movie that had extremely long takes in which, quote-unquote, nothing happened. And I remember reading reviews of it when it came out, when it premiered at Sundance, and people were describing how boring it is and how there were these 15-minute long shots of just two guys walking through a desert. And so I was a little trepidatious when I went to see it. I was, just thinking like, oh, do I really want to go subject myself to what is inevitably going to be a really boring film? And what I saw instead was an incredibly thrilling movie. It really, really made me just sit up straight. It excited me like few films had up to that point, because I was watching a director use time in a way I'd never seen before. The idea that, this movie was boring was shocking to me, because it was so clear that everything in there, the way that duration was utilized was so intentional and was used to tell a story, and to tell a story that could only be told cinematically. The thing that makes film different than any other medium really is the imposition of time. I think music is the only other art form that uses time, but film imposes time on an image and on sounds. And when you use long takes, it sort of puts that imposition front and center, and that's what I was seeing in Jerry for the first time.
Do you realize I haven't kissed you in over an hour?
A Ghost Story is very much about the passage of time, and so I wanted that passage to exist for the audience. I wanted them to experience that passage of time, for that passage of time to become part of the experience of watching the film itself. And so it just made sense to use long takes. Sometimes that movie moves very quickly. Towards the end of the film, we move through centuries in, a matter of 3 or 4 cuts. But at the beginning, I wanted to really put time front and center, and the passage of time and all that entails. And that does involve boredom, that does involve tedium, that does involve the feelings that transpire when you're just sitting still for a long period of time. But time is very pliable. As we move through our lives day to day, we experience time in different ways. Sometimes it moves very quickly, sometimes it moves very slowly, and I wanted the film to encompass all of those things. I think that Jerry functioned very differently. Jerry was a movie that used time to show a dynamic and to let a dynamic emerge. And it needed that time for that dynamic to fully catalyze itself so that the story could reach the apex that it needed to reach. It was all of those shots in Jerry, or most of them, are moving. They're all taking us somewhere, and they last for a long time, but there is a clear progression of things happening in them. Sometimes you'll have two characters walking, and the pace at which they're walking and who's walking ahead of the other says a lot about what is going on in the story in that moment. And that is fantastic. I love letting, those types of dynamics emerge over a long period of time. But with a ghost story, I was more content to just sit there. When we have those long takes, there's not a whole lot going on. And there's a whole other school of slow cinema that I was drawing inspiration from there. But it's definitely very different from what Van Sant was doing with Jerry, even though that, it sort of predicates my own interest in that type of storytelling. I think that when you are shooting a long take, it can change depending on what the content of that take is, what you're trying to capture. There's a scene in a ghost story where Rooney Mara goes to see Casey Affleck's body in the morgue, and then shortly thereafter, he wakes up and becomes the ghost. And that was all done in one take, and it was intended to be one take. And that one was a little trickier than others because we have to see the body, and we have to recognize the actor playing that body, and then he also has to sit up and become a ghost. And for that sheet to function, in a way that where you can pull back the sheet, lay it back over the face again, and then when he sits up for it to cover his entire body, that was just like classic special effects. Like, you just need to figure out how to make that all work in one shot. In the same way a magician would try to pull off a magical trick on stage. You have to figure out how to do it without breaking the illusion, without using a cut. And so you have to take those things into consideration. That's something that, is very specific to that one shot. And that shot was intended to be one shot. It was described in the screenplay as a single take. And when Rooney walks out, from the time she walks out to the time that the ghost sits up, we had a stopwatch there on set. We were just saying, okay, we're going to let a whole minute go by. We just want a whole minute to go by, and then he's going to sit up. And that was all very intentional. But on top of that, you have all of this, this business with the bedsheet that could go horribly wrong. So you have to plan all that stuff out, try to make sure that that's going to work, so that I think we did that probably 5 or 6 times before we really got it working. And that shot was originally quite a bit longer and had a lot more going on to it. There was a lot more at stake. We had, I think the final shot in the movie is probably 3 or 4 minutes long, and in the original version it was probably 5 or 6. And it was, there were a whole lot of things that could go wrong at any point in that, whether it was, getting the dialogue right, getting the timing right, getting the bedsheet to work right, getting the ghost performance right the first time. And then on the other hand, you have a scene like the pie scene, where once you've set it up, it's ready to go. And there's not much that can go wrong in it because all you're doing is capturing reality. It's much closer to documentary filmmaking in that you're capturing a real moment, and that real moment's going to last as long as it needs to last. But it's not documentary filmmaking because you're also contextualizing the image through, cinematic affectation. So we lit that scene. It was designed a very specific way, and we had the camera placed in a very specific way, and all of those things were thought out in advance. But once you start recording, hit record, once the actors are performing, the scene transpires without any sort of input from me as the director. You just step back and let reality take over. So I think, that scene was one of the hardest scenes for me to do in the movie. It was one of the hardest scenes I've ever shot because as a director, I keep wanting to get in my own way. I keep thinking if this gets boring, let's have the camera on dolly so we can do a slow push in. Or what if we have the light do some sort of dramatic change halfway through the scene so all of a sudden she's shrouded in darkness. You're just trying, I kept trying to think of ways to get in my own way. And because I was scared of it. I was scared of letting time go on for that long and for prioritizing time in that scene in such a way. And in the same way that I was scared of going to see Jerry way back when because I thought I might get bored. I had that same fear as a filmmaker that I might be boring people. And so I kept looking for ways to make it interesting. But ultimately, I knew deep down that if we just, executed the scene as planned, it would be interesting, it would be emotional. And so all I had to do was just get out of my own way, find the best way to shoot the scene. I had to light it with my cinematographer, and then we just step back and let it happen. I think, if a filmmaker who is inspired by the same films that I was inspired in and wants to utilize long takes, I think that the key is to make sure that there's a reason for it. Because anybody could just set up a camera and let it roll for a long time, you're going to have a long take. But the reason a movie like Jerry isn't boring is because those shots are there for a reason. The reason Tarkovsky films work or Chantal Akerman's films work is because they're all sustained for a very specific reason, and the movies require that. So they never feel that long when you're watching them. You know, you understand that they're long. You process the fact that these shots are lasting for an unusual length of time, but they're so appropriate for the film that it doesn't feel that exceptional while you're watching the movie. It just feels like a natural part of the film-going experience. And so I think the most important thing is to have a film that demands it, and not all films need it. You know, I haven't made that many movies with long takes because the movies I've made don't really require them. But A Ghost Story was one that needed to have that sort of relationship with time, needed to put time front and center, and so it made sense. I've loved these movies for years. I've always wanted to make a movie with long takes, but I wasn't going to do it until I had a movie that needed them. So I think that's probably the most important thing.
8hours.com has been on an extended hiatus since the pandemic began, but make sure to check out the website, it's really cool. You can search movies, directors, or concepts to find videos. I'm hoping it will start up again soon, because it's a really great idea. And check out the 8 Hours YouTube channel for more videos with David Lowery and other fascinating people. This video was made possible by Blackmagic Design. I've been working on a series of one-off videos to go alongside the Apocalypse Now series, and Blackmagic Design reached out to ask if I'd like to try their 6K Blackmagic Pocket camera. I really like it. The picture is incredible, and it's so light and easy to take around and shoot. It has a Super 35 sensor and takes EF photographic lenses, allowing for a shallower depth of field than the Micro Four Thirds sensor. The big touchscreen interface is really sleek and easy to use, and it can record directly onto a solid-state drive. You can also load custom 3D LUTs onto the camera to get a preview of what the footage will look like after color correction. And it comes with DaVinci Resolve, which was already a beast of a program back when I was using the first Pocket camera, and now it's basically a one-stop shop for editing, mixing, color, and export. I'm still working on making the set in my new apartment, but I'll do a little tour of my setup once I have everything ready. Thanks so much for watching, and make sure to click the playlist so you can watch the other videos we did with David Lowery.